Hello, I'm Caroline. Welcome to my channel. In this video today, I'd like to take a look at this book, The Life and World of Boudicca by Struan Reid. And let's just get started, and I hope you find it interesting. Who was Boudicca? Boudicca was a warrior queen who lived in Britain nearly 2,000 years ago. She led her people called the Iceni in an uprising against the Roman forces who were occupying Britain at that time. With terrifying speed, Boudicca and her armies of Celtic warriors swept across southeastern England, fighting, burning towns and killing as they went. Her rebellion caused terrible damage to the Roman forces, and the Celts remained a problem for the Roman Empire for many years to come. Boudicca's rebellion was like a raging fire that blew across the country, but in less than a year, Boudicca was defeated by the Romans. Rather than suffer the disgrace of being dragged through the streets of Rome in a public parade, Boudicca killed herself. Today, Boudicca is still one of the most famous characters in British history. She's remembered as a brave warrior queen who led her people in a last attempt to preserve the independence of the British people against the conquering armies of the Roman Empire. She was also a powerful female leader at a time when most leaders were men. This statue of Queen Boudicca driving her chariot stands on the banks of the River Thames in London, near the Houses of Parliament. This statue was put up in 1902. We know very little about Boudicca's early life. This is because the Celts did not keep written records. Most of the information we have about them comes from Roman writers. We know about Boudicca's rebellion from two Roman historians, called Tacitus and Dio Cassius. We have to be careful, though, when reading their books, because the Romans were enemies of the Celts. Their writings can be very unfair to Boudicca and her supporters. This map shows southern Britain in AD 61, when Boudicca led her rebellion against the Romans. The blue arrows show Boudicca's route: Ruralemium, St Albans, Londinium, Londinium, Colchester, and East Anglia. Here are some key dates. 55 or 54 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar invades Celtic Britain but fails to conquer it. About AD 30, Boudicca is born in East Anglia in southeastern England. AD 43, the Romans under the Emperor Claudius conquer Britain. About AD 48, Boudicca marries King Prasutagus of the Iceni and becomes queen of the Iceni. AD 54 to 68, rule of the Roman Emperor Nero. About AD 61, Boudicca leads a rebellion against Roman rule in southeastern England. AD 61, the death of Queen Boudicca. Boudicca's early life. Although Boudicca is famous, very little is known about her early life. All we know is that she was born about the year AD 30, and that her family were probably important aristocrats who lived in the region now known as East Anglia. Boudicca is sometimes known by her Roman name of Boudicca, and she was probably named after the Celtic goddess of victory, Boudicca. Like the children of most Celtic families, Boudicca would have been sent away as a young girl to join the household of another aristocratic family. There she would have received her education, learning about the history and customs of her tribe. This exchange of children was an important way of building friendships and loyalty between different families and tribes. While she was growing up, Boudicca was probably also trained to be a warrior. There were special training schools where girls as well as boys were taught how to fight with swords and spears, to ride horses and to drive chariots. The Celts were brilliant artists, and their beautiful metalwork was famous throughout Europe. This bronze cow's head was probably the handle of a ceremonial bucket. The Celts lived in small villages in the countryside. They were a farming people, and most families owned a number of sheep, cattle and other animals. As Boudicca was born into a rich family, they would have owned many animals. They would probably have had a large round house where they lived, ate and slept. They probably also had several other smaller thatched buildings which were used for keeping animals and sorting food. This copy of a Celtic roundhouse has been built at Little Buster in Hampshire. The walls and roof were made of small tree trunks. The walls were filled in with wattle and daub, mud and sticks, and the roof was thatched with grasses. Queen Boudicca. Boudicca was expected to marry into another aristocratic family, or even into a royal family. The lands of the Iceni tribe were in the area known today as East Anglia. They lay to the south of her own tribal lands. Boudicca's family probably knew the royal family of the Iceni. The Iceni tribe occupied lands in the area of the present-day counties of Suffolk and Norfolk. By about AD 48, she would have been about 18 years old. Boudicca had married Prasutagus, king of the Iceni. He was probably about 10 years old when she was. He was probably about 10 years older than she was. Their wedding would have been celebrated with offerings to the Celtic gods, followed by a magnificent feast. It would have been a splendid occasion, with guests invited from far away and delicious food and drink served for a whole day and night. The wedding celebrations would have been used as a display of wealth and power by the families of Boudicca and Prasutagus, and also as a way of making strong bonds between their two tribes. Following her marriage, Boudicca became queen of the Iceni and went to live in her husband's royal household. After about a year, she gave birth to a daughter, followed a year later by another daughter. We don't know the names of the two princesses. Servants and nursemaids would have helped Boudicca raise the two girls, but it was the duty of every Celtic mother to make sure that her children received the correct education and training for adulthood. Celtic women spent much of their time looking after their families, preparing food, spinning wool and making clothes. You can see the loom for weaving cloth, a cooking fire, and a stone for grinding corn inside this copy of a Celtic roundhouse. The royal inheritance. King Prasutagus had been ruler of the Iceni for at least 5 years when he married Boudicca. Celtic kings did not always inherit their position from their fathers. They were often elected by the other noblemen in the tribe, or became king by marrying the queen. In about AD 49, or 50, a number of tribes in southeastern England rose up against the Roman armies that had invaded England in AD 43. The rebellion was quickly crushed by the Romans. King Prasutagus had been one of the leaders of the rebellion, but he was allowed to keep his lands and his throne. However, the Romans now recognized him as a client king only, accepted for as long as he did as he was told by them. In about AD 61, King Prasutagus died. Boudicca was now about 30 years old, and her two daughters were about 11 and 12. Boudicca became regent of the Iceni. That is, she became their ruler until a new king could be chosen by the tribal chiefs. This Roman coin shows the head of Nero, who was emperor at the time of Boudicca's rebellion. It was made in AD 55. The head behind Nero is his mother, Agrippina. Prasutagus had left a will when he died. This gave half his property and lands to the Roman emperor. As a client king who was under the control of the Romans, this was expected. He left the other half of his property to Boudicca and their two daughters. Prasutagus probably believed that he had left a peaceful settlement behind him, satisfying both the Romans and his family. Events were quickly to prove how wrong he was. Claudius was emperor at the time of the Roman invasion of Britain. This bronze head of Claudius was found in the River Auld in Suffolk. In AD 43, the Roman Emperor Claudius launched an invasion of Britain. Many of the British tribes, especially in southern England, surrendered to the invading army. Others continued to fight the Romans fiercely. It was to be many years before all the southern tribes were defeated. The Romans never succeeded in conquering Scotland. The Queen's Fury. A few days after the death of King Prasutagus, the chief Roman financial administrator of Britain, who was called Catus Decianus, sent his officials to Boudicca's royal residence. They brought a message. As well as taking the property left to the Roman emperor by Prasutagus, Decianus was now also seizing the property that the king had left to Boudicca and her daughters. Decianus ignored Prasutagus's will and proceeded to force Boudicca and her daughters off their land. He warned the chiefs of the Iceni tribe that their property would also be taken in the name of the Roman Empire. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "Kingdom and household alike were plundered like prizes of war. The chiefdoms of the Iceni were deprived of their family estates, as if the whole country had been handed over to the Romans. The king's own relatives were treated as slaves." This 18th century engraving shows Queen Boudicca speaking to her warriors. Many of them would have been from the Iceni tribe. Boudicca was outraged and tried to prevent the Romans stealing her property. They decided to make an example of her in order to frighten the rest of her people. She was arrested by a group of soldiers and led to an open space. There she was stripped naked, and in front of the Roman officials and her own horrified people, she was publicly beaten. Worse still, her two daughters were also badly treated by the Roman soldiers. This terrible behaviour was to show the Iceni that they were now totally under the control of the Romans. This small statue is of Epona, Celtic goddess of horses and fertility. Women often held positions of great power in the Celtic world, and Epona was one of the most important of all the Celtic gods. Boudicca Attacks. Boudicca exploded with fury. The Romans had gone too far. She would make them pay dearly for their terrible action. The Iceni rallied around their queen, calling for revenge against the Romans. Many other Celtic tribes also supported her, united in their hatred of the Roman invaders. Just beyond the southern borders of the Iceni lands lay the Roman towns of Londinium, present-day Colchester in Essex. It served as the capital of the Roman government in Britain. But Boudicca had another, far more important reason for wanting to destroy Londinium. It was the headquarters of the soldiers who had committed the crime against herself and her daughters. Meanwhile, unaware that Boudicca was raising an army of rebellion, the Roman governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away attacking the island of Mona in Anglesey in northern Wales. This 19th century illustration shows Boudicca leading her warriors into battle. A Roman historian described her as very tall with long red hair. An attack on Camalodunum. Led by their warrior queen, her huge army poured out of the thick forest where they had been hiding. They reached Camalodunum and the army burst into the town. The garrison and some of the people shut themselves into the temple. They managed to hold out for 2 days, but no help came. Boudicca's army overran the temple. All the inhabitants of Camalodunum, men, women and children, were killed. The town was set alight. It burned furiously. By the next day it had been reduced to a blackened ruin. Boudicca now turned her attention to Londinium, London. The rebellion sweeps on. Boudicca and her warriors had now tasted victory. Nothing was going to stop them as they swept south towards the town of Londinium. The Romans were in panic. Desperate messages were sent out all over Britain to try to raise reinforcements. 5,000 Roman soldiers were sent from a camp 129 kilometres to the north of Camalodunum. But as they marched south, they were ambushed, and at least half of them were killed. Catus Decianus, whose terrible treatment of Boudicca and her family had led to the rebellion, was waiting for the extra soldiers to come to his rescue in Londinium. They never arrived. As news reached him that Boudicca and her army were getting closer and closer, he decided that he would have to abandon the town. He took all his staff with him and fled, leaving the people of Londinium to defend themselves. This modern painting by Richard Sorrell shows Londinium on fire after Boudicca's attack. The city contained about 30,000 people, most of them merchants and their families. Londinium falls. Meanwhile, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus had marched his soldiers all the way from Wales and managed to reach Londinium before Boudicca. He decided, though, that he couldn't defend the town. It had no strong walls, and his soldiers were exhausted after their rapid march from Wales. Tacitus wrote that Suetonius decided to save the whole situation by the sacrifice of a single city. Soon after Suetonius had left, Boudicca and her army swooped onto the town and killed everyone they found there. Once again the buildings were set alight and burned to the ground. These skulls from the Roman period were found in the Walbrook River in London. They may have been victims of Boudicca's attack on Londinium. The fall of Ruralemium. Leaving the smouldering ruins of Londinium behind them, Boudicca and her army turned north and headed for another Roman town. This was Ruralemium, the present-day city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. Ruralemium did not contain soldiers like Londinium or Roman merchants like Londinium. It was inhabited only by British people, most of them from the Catabalani tribe. They supported the occupying Romans, so they were hated and despised by Boudicca and her followers. The Roman governor Suetonius had by now retreated north with his soldiers to the Midlands region of England. He had decided that Ruralemium would also have to be sacrificed before he was ready to fight Boudicca. This is a model of a Celtic war chariot. Chariots like this were made of wood and held 2 people. A driver made the horses gallop at great speed. A warrior stood behind the driver to fight. As news of Boudicca's approaching army reached the town, many people packed up their belongings and took to the roads, leading away from the town. There was now nowhere else for them to hide, except in the forests and valleys of the surrounding countryside. Many more of the Catabalani people, perhaps as many as 15,000 of the old, the very young and the sick had to be left behind. There was nothing they could do but wait for the end. Like hungry wolves, Boudicca and her warriors pounced on Ruralemium and tore it apart. Everyone left behind was killed. Once more the buildings were burned to the ground. Boudicca had now destroyed 3 important Roman towns. It seemed that nothing could stop her. Boudicca misses her chance. Boudicca and her army may have looked invincible when they left the ruined town of Ruralemium, but events were now running out of control, and there was little Boudicca could do to stop them. It was now that Boudicca made a great mistake. As she and her warriors were rampaging across the countryside, Suetonius was keeping out of her way. He was in a very weak position, so it was at this point that Boudicca should have attacked his army. She missed this chance of victory, though. This gave the Romans precious extra time to regroup and prepare for the final battle. While Boudicca's followers were strong in numbers and enthusiastic, in most other ways they didn't match up to the efficient and well-trained Roman army. Her army was not being paid as the Roman soldiers were. While Boudicca's warriors were away from their homes, their farms were being neglected. Crops had not been sown in the fields. There would be no harvest, and soon they would run out of food and supplies. If that happened, the warriors would start to return to their farms, and the rebellion would collapse. A Celtic sword had a long iron blade, which was razor-sharp along both edges. This one has a handle in the shape of a human figure. Suetonius makes his move. It was Suetonius who now decided that he must finally confront Boudicca's army. Tacitus tells us, by now Suetonius Paulinus had with him the 18th Legion and a detachment of the 20th Legion together with auxiliary, supporting troops from the nearest fort, about 10,000 men, and he decided to make an end of delay and join battle. At last, Boudicca received news about where Suetonius and his soldiers were hiding. It may be that Suetonius had decided to let her scouts find out where he was, so that he could lead Boudicca and her army into a trap. Historians today are still uncertain where exactly the final battle between Boudicca and the Romans took place, but it was probably somewhere in the region of the counties of Warwickshire and Leicestershire in the West Midlands. Suetonius chose his site for the battle very carefully. Tacitus wrote that the governor and his army were in a narrow valley with a wood behind them. They positioned themselves at the top of a steep slope at the end of the valley, giving them a much better position than the British below them. This tombstone from Gloucester shows a Thracian cavalryman riding down a British warrior. Tacitus tells us that before the battle began, Boudicca gave one last rousing speech to her followers. She drove in her chariot amongst her warriors with her 2 young daughters in front of her. She reminded her followers of the conquest and robbery of their lands by the hated Romans, and warned them that if they didn't win this battle, all would be lost forever. Then she said, "You will win this battle or die. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." At the end of this speech, the Britons let out a great shout and called on their gods to support them. These 3 gold torques were made in the 1st century BC and were found in Norfolk. Celtic warriors believed that wearing a torque round their necks gave them magical protection. British warriors started to pour into the narrow valley, shouting and singing as they came. The Roman historians tell us that as many as 100,000 British faced a Roman army of no more than 13,000. The Romans were drawn up in a straight line at the top end of the valley. Suetonius had positioned his legionaries in the centre of the line, with more soldiers on either side of them. At both ends of the line were the cavalry on horseback. Boudicca and Suetonius then gave their armies the order to attack. The British charged forward, blowing horns and shouting their war cries. The Roman soldiers sent out a shower of spears, and many of the British were killed instantly. The Roman cavalry then moved in from the sides and prevented the British from spreading out. The Romans were far better trained and disciplined than the British. When one row of soldiers had attacked, it moved back. The next row would come forward in wave after wave. This carving on this stone coffin shows a battle between the Romans and the Gauls, who were Celts from northern France. The British are defeated. There were now far too many British warriors crowded into the valley. They were packed in so tightly that they could not use their long swords against the Romans. Thousands of Boudicca's warriors were killed. According to Tacitus, there fell 80,000 of the Britons, with a loss to our soldiers of about 400. Boudicca's army had at last been defeated, and the British uprising against the Romans had been crushed. The Romans wrote how tall and impressive the Celtic warriors looked, with magnificent bodies and terrifying battle cries. Some painted their bodies and combed lime through their hair to make it stand on end. This is a modern-day reenactment. The death of Boudicca. Boudicca herself probably led her warriors into a battle against the Romans. She charged at the head of her army in her chariot, her red hair flowing over her shoulders and her 2 daughters by her side. It is believed that Boudicca didn't die on the battlefield. She managed to escape with her daughters to a hiding place. There, it is said, she gave the 2 princesses poison to drink and then drank some herself. Boudicca knew that if they were captured alive, a terrible end would be in store for them. They would be taken in chains to Rome and forced to walk through the streets in a victory parade. Then they would be killed. Instead, we think Queen Boudicca and her daughters died quietly and bravely on the land they had fought so hard to defend from the Roman invaders. This Victorian marble statue shows Boudicca and her two daughters after their final battle with the Romans. No one really knows how they died or where they were buried. What happened to Boudicca and her daughters after they died is not certain. Dio Cassius writes only that she was given a costly burial fit for such a great queen. Much later in the 17th century, a story grew up that Boudicca was buried at the ancient site of Stonehenge, but this is not likely. Other suggested sites for her grave include one in her own family lands in Norfolk, another in Hampstead in North London, and even one under Platform 8 of King's Cross Station in London. We will never really know what became of Boudicca's body. Like the beginning of her life, very little is known about her end. Rich Celts like Boudicca were often buried with their chariots and even their horses. This Celtic chariot was found in a burial at Garton-on-the-Wolds in Yorkshire. And so this is where I'll end this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me again soon for another one. Bye.